Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Mystic Mythos, a collection of stories. And today I'm going to share with you my story. I've had a little bit of anxiety about this. I've only ever shared my story publicly one other time. So if you know me, you've probably heard bits and pieces of my story, or I've probably told you some of my background, but I've never told the whole thing. So bear with me, I guess. So I was born in a really small town. I think when I was born, the population of the town was probably around 3,500 people. So it's pretty small. I was the oldest. I'm the first of 7 children, 6 children on my mom's side and 1 on my dad's side. My parents were not married. My mom believes that I was conceived when she tried to break up with my dad. So that's a pretty great start, right? On my mom's side, I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters. I have a sister that's just younger than me. And then I have 3 brothers. And then my youngest sibling is also a sister. And then, as I said, on my dad's side, I have 1 sibling as well, and that's another sister. So my mom came from a pretty religious family. Her parents were LDS, and she was really concerned about what some of the backlash in her family would have been for having a child out of wedlock. That was a pretty big deal back then. Not very common still. It was more common than like in the 1800s, of course, but she found a man who also needed to get married. His was for legal reasons, but they found each other and they decided to get married. So they got married when she was about 6 months pregnant with me. She was married to him, I believe, for about 9 years. She got divorced from him when I was almost 9. So the issue was that he had spent a lot of time running from the law. He was involved pretty heavily in drug trafficking and had a really hard time holding down a steady job. So growing up was pretty rough. He was gone a lot, off and on. We were told a lot of different stories when I was pretty young about why he was gone or where he had been, or, at one point they told us that he had been drafted into the war, which now as an adult I can look at it and say that makes 0 sense. I found out when I was quite a bit older that he had actually been in prison. And I do have a foggy memory of my young life being in the back of a pickup truck with him and getting pulled over by the police, and the police having to call my mom to come pick us up. I don't know how old I was. I think I was probably 7 when that happened. So like I said, she divorced him, and about 6 months later, she got married to the man that's now my stepdad. I struggled with that, of course. I found out when my mom got divorced that my father was not the same man as the 3 siblings that I had at the time, which is the sister just younger than me and 2 brothers. I had grown up to that point thinking that he was my father, and finding out that he was not at the age of 8 was really difficult for me. I was pretty confused by it at first, but then I also felt like a little bit relieved because I had lived my whole life at that point with this man, and he was not kind. He was pretty abusive physically and emotionally. I had seen him hit my mother multiple times. He was not good at handling being upset. He spent a lot of time trying to figure out ways to manipulate the system so that we could have a source of income. Um, he just was not a nice person. It's a hard memory for me to look back at that and to see what kind of people were in my life. I also think that he is a big part of why I have a hard time trusting other people, because when I got older, I didn't trust him. And there's this like difficult situation in living with your parent and having it be someone you can't trust because you've seen them over and over again do things that trustworthy people don't do. Anyway, he was really hard to be around. And so there was definitely a sense of relief when I found out that he was not my father. Um, but then there was the challenge of figuring out who my father was. So my mom told me when she got divorced, a man started coming over to our house. And I asked her one day, I said, "Who is that guy?" And she said, "That's your dad." And I was like, "What?" That didn't make any sense at all in my 8-year-old brain. Um, and then I found out that it could be him and it could be two other people. She believed that it was him because of the timing, but also because I looked a lot like him when I was young. And I was like, okay, well, that's fine. And I was willing to accept the situation for what it was. There were multiple times when I was growing up that I reached out to him for support, and he was not in a place where he wanted to be that support to me. One, because he wasn't sure that I was his daughter, which I can understand. Um, but also, I think because he didn't have his own life sorted out. There was a little bit of time, like that year that I found out who he was, I spent Christmas with him and his wife. And then after that, he had committed to like come and pick me up on a Saturday or whatever, whenever he had time. And I was so excited, and I would sit on the couch in the living room and look out the window and wait for him all day, and he would never show up. At one point, my mom finally, I think it was probably 4 or 5 times after he had told me he was going to be there, my mom finally told him, "You can't keep doing this. It's not fair." And I was lucky in that my stepdad was a pretty accepting person. He was there for a lot of stuff from the time that I was 9 until I moved out of my parents' house. So he was always pretty supportive, as much as he could be. So I reached out to my biological dad a couple of times in my teen years. I was going through some really hard stuff, and I reached out and asked him if I could come live with him, and he told me yes. And then the day I was supposed to move in with him, he called me and told me I couldn't. And I'll explain that a little bit later when I get to that part. But I had this off and on, back and forth stuff for years with him. And finally, when I was 16, I went to his house during my lunch at high school, and I left him a note that said, "If you don't want to be a part of my life, that's fine. But I'm not going to keep reaching out and trying to make this connection with you because it hurts too much." And I didn't hear from him after that. So, to get back to my 9-year-old self, my mom got married in January, and me and my younger sister and my 2 younger brothers were all there. Shortly after that, my mom, she found out in March, I think, that she was pregnant with my 3rd brother, and she had a lot of complications with that pregnancy. I think a big contributor to that was probably stress, because she was fighting for custody of the other kids. She didn't have to fight for me because he wasn't my father. And I was fine with that, but she had to fight for the other 3 because they were his children. And it was really messy. I don't remember I don't remember a lot of that. I do remember having to talk to someone from DCFS at one point, and I remember my mom being gone a lot. She had to go to court a lot, and my stepdad went with her, and so I would stay with my grandma. My grandma, my stepdad's parents, she lived right next to us, so I just went over and would spend the day with her, and that was a lot easier than trying to find a babysitter, I'm sure. And my grandparents were amazing. I really, really enjoyed all the time that I got to spend with them. They were very accepting people. They had 7 or 8 kids, and all but one had been adopted through the foster care system. So they had been foster parents to tons and tons of kids. There were plenty of kids that they didn't adopt that they had in their home for extended periods of time. And my grandma was, she is a very, she's very particular. she she really had a way that everything needed to be in order for her to be happy. um she's kind of picky, but not in a necessarily negative way. I always thought that it was just an endearing quality in her. And luckily for me, she's still around. She sends me a letter probably once a month, a handwritten letter. Um, and I write back as often as I can. I don't get to see her as much. She moved to another part of the state where I don't get to spend a lot of time with her. And my grandpa passed away. It'll be 4 years in October. So I spent a lot of time with them during that time, and there was a point where my mom was put on bed rest during this pregnancy, and my stepdad was trying to continue to fight, but they weren't his children, and so there were a lot of things that were said by my mom's ex-husband and his family that ended up being the tipping point for that custody battle. And my mom, because she was having so many other complications and it was affecting her health, she had to give up that fight. And when I was young, I really didn't understand that. That was hard for me to wrap my brain around, like, how do you just stop fighting? But I didn't understand the pregnancy complications, and I didn't understand how it was affecting her as a person. So I was just angry about it. And around that same point in time, we moved into my stepdad's house. And it was a small house. And that house is where the hard part of my story began. From the age of 9 to the age of 14, I was repeatedly assaulted by a family member. Um, and it began in that house. And after seeing everything that my mom had gone through, and after losing all of my other siblings, I was so afraid to say anything because I didn't want to lose the rest of my family. I felt like I had already lost my whole family because I wasn't allowed to see my siblings. And I had a new brother that was on the way, but it was different, I think, is really what it was. Like, it was different that time because before it had always been just me and my mom and the other siblings because her first husband was, now I know, in and out of jail, and he just was not present for a lot of things. And we kind of always knew that we were on our own, but now it was her and my stepdad, and I just felt like an outsider for a long time. When I was about, I think I was 12 when my youngest sister was born. If not, I was 11 and almost 12. She was born while I was at school. She was the only other baby with red hair. So we were the only 2 out of 6 that ended up having the ginger gene, which is kind of funny. When I was 13, I found out that my biological dad had been remarried and that he had a baby on the way as well. And that was really hard for me. I was in 7th grade, and finding out that he was having a baby, not only a baby, but a daughter, then I felt like I was really being replaced. And nobody in my life noticed that there was anything wrong with me except for my home ec teacher, which I will forever be grateful to her for noticing the slight change in me at that point. She called my mom and she told my mom that I was having a hard time in class and that I was not myself. So my mom came and picked me up from school that day, which I thought was really weird because she never picked me up from school. And she asked me what was going on. And that's the first time that I really remember my mom trying to connect with me. And trying to understand what was happening. And I told her, I just broke down and cried the whole ride home and told her, like, I feel like I'm being replaced, that I wasn't good enough, which is always the battle, right? That you're not good enough. And that because of that, he was going to replace me with this baby, which I realize now as an adult is a completely silly way to look at things. But as an adult, you have a lot more, experience when you look at stuff like that. So that was really hard for me. I had, at that point, like I was still making an attempt to connect with my birth father. I reached out a year later. That's when I asked him if I could move in with him when I was about 14. Because the family member that was assaulting me was still doing it. And we had moved a couple of times, and I thought maybe that would stop it from happening. And it wasn't frequent, not like every day, but it was frequent enough, like every month. And initially, I thought that that was where the hard part of my story started. But I learned pretty recently that that was not the case. The hard part of my story started when I was 5, when it happened the first time. I learned that while I was in therapy over the last 6 months. And let me tell you how weird that was. I had very, very few memories from my childhood when I was younger than the age of like 7 or 8. I think I only had like 2 memories from before that time. And certainly I had no memories before I was 5 or 6. So when I was in therapy and this memory came back through, I remember asking my therapist, I was like, is this real? Like, is this even real? Because it felt like when you wake up from a really weird dream and you have like a dream hangover and there's just residual pieces that are there and you can't remember exactly what happened, but you remember the feeling of what happened. And it started like that. So it was like waking up from a dream in reverse. So it started out as fragments and pieces, and it was almost like smoke. Like if I tried to grab it, it would dissipate and move around me. And I spent a whole day with these little pieces coming back through. And by lunchtime, I knew that it wasn't just a dream. I knew that it was real. And after lunch, I started having a really physical response to this memory. And I felt like I was going to throw up. It was just such a bizarre thing to experience. And now to have that be a whole piece that I remember very clearly what happened. I'm just processing the grief of that still. I spent quite a few days being angry. I spent several days where I was really upset about it and cried a lot. And now I'm trying to move from the angry space into a place where I'm indifferent to it and I just accept it. I'm trying to get to that acceptance stage. But But that's proving to be more difficult than I had imagined. But I also need to remember that when I was going through therapy and dealing with the family member, it took me years to move past the angry point. So I'm just going to be patient with that. So when I was 14, I finally got to the point that I had to tell my mom what was going on. I had to tell my mom about this assault that was happening. It had been going on for almost 5 years. Moving didn't change anything. That's the problem with it being a family member, I suppose. And the last time that it happened, the severity of it was much worse than the other times. I went to my room in tears, and the only thing that I could think of that would help at the time was to pray. I didn't know what else to do. So I asked for strength because I knew that I was going to have to continue to carry this burden. And I asked for courage because I knew that I was going to have to be brave in order to get through it. And I prayed so hard that no other person would ever have to go through that in my family again. And I did not realize that I was opening a can of worms with that. That I basically was asking at 14 to be the one to break this cycle. I was genuinely afraid that if I didn't speak up, I was going to die. At that point in my life, I was also starting to struggle with anxiety. My mom has had a lifelong struggle with anxiety, and I had started to experience some pretty severe symptoms of depression. I told my mom that I was scared. I told her I didn't feel safe in my own body, which is a very weird feeling. And I've felt that way a couple of times in my life. I also told her that I thought that I might have depression and I wanted to see a doctor, and she told me that I was being dramatic. And a year later, I made my first attempt to take my own life when I was 15. At that point, I was in high school, and there were a lot more options for not being home. So I hated being home because I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe with myself, and especially not in a home where that kept happening to me. So I overcommitted to anything school related. I was a part of cheer. I was part of the French club. I joined the drama club. I did debate. I was in the school musical, and literally any other activity that I could stay after school for. If a teacher needed help, you betcha, I was there. Sign me up. If the track team needed help setting up hurdles, I was there setting up hurdles. I hated it. I hated most of that, but it was better than being at home. I was like the classic example of an overachiever, and I did not know how to set boundaries with people. I felt constantly burned out. I was anxious pretty much 24/7. And when I got to high school, I started coping in any method that I could. Mostly that meant drinking alcohol and taking prescription pills. I genuinely felt like I hated myself. I didn't believe in anything anymore at that point, mostly because I just couldn't see how there could be a God if he would let those kind of things happen to a person. I felt like I had already been through so much stuff in my life. I was like, why more? Like, where is this coming from? Who is sending this to me? Like, why does this keep happening? So I didn't believe in God at that point. And I kept coping in the same way until I was 17. It was when I started my senior year. I think it was the summer before I started my senior year that I finally started to clean myself up. I had ruined a lot of friendships and relationships, minus, I don't know, 4 or 5 friends that had assumed that I was going through something, and those are the few people that I still talk to from high school today. I'm really lucky in that around that same time period, there was one girl, she had been on cheer with me, and she reached out to me and said, "Do you want to come hang out with me at my house?" And it was one day, one of very few days that I didn't have something planned after school, and I had been dreading going home that day because I was planning on making another attempt at taking my own life. And when she asked me, I was like, this feels different. Like this interaction with her, it felt important to me in some way. And so I said, okay, I'll come hang out with you. When we left the high school, she lived in the same town as me. And I told my mom I was going to go over there, and I grabbed a bag of clothes and I drove over to her house. I didn't expect anything to happen from it, but I knew that she wanted me to sleep over. So I stayed there, and having that genuine interaction with her absolutely changed my life. She's one of very few people that I still talk to from high school today. And like, thank God that she reached out, because it was like that classic story where there's the kid who is sad and who struggles and is quiet and all of that. And, you know, one person says, "Hey, let me carry your books home and I'll walk with you." And that day changes the course of their life. And this day changed the course of mine. And this is a friendship that's very important to me and I still maintain to this day. At that point, I felt like maybe there was hope, which was weird because I had spent a lot of years at that point, probably half of my life that I was alive, thinking that there was no hope and there was no reason for all of these things happening and there was no purpose behind it. And I didn't believe in God. And so I was like, well, then what the hell is the point? I had a really hard time forming healthy attachments. And I know for a fact that there probably were times with this friend that I said or did things that made her uncomfortable because I was trying to figure out, like, how do I make a healthy relationship with another person when all the examples of relationships that I had at that point were abandonment, neglect, and pain in some form or another. I felt like my mom had really detached herself from me. I wasn't really close to her, especially in those later years. I spent a lot of time when I was home taking care of my younger siblings. In the beginning, it was my younger sister and my 2 brothers from the first marriage, and then later on, it was my brother and sister from the second marriage. I had a lot of resentment. I really did not know how to wrestle with those feelings. And I don't blame my mother today. I am not angry with her about these things because I know and understand now that she had her own trauma that she was trying to deal with. And I can appreciate that as an adult. So I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years trying to figure out how to reforge this relationship, because the relationship as it existed when I was young was not healthy or helpful. There was just a lot, like I said, there was a lot of trauma associated with that, and I don't want that to forever be a part of our relationship story, which is partially why I started going back to therapy. Well, it's been almost a year, I guess. I had formed a lot of trauma bonds with my family and my early relationships. I always felt like I had to work really hard to provide value or I would be rejected or replaced. And looking back at my story, it does make sense that I felt that way. At 17, the summer after my junior year, before my senior year, I had decided that the only way that I would be able to go to college would be to join the military. I couldn't afford to pay for college, and with my coping mechanism being prescription pills. I had not focused well enough in high school to get good grades to be able to get scholarships. And I knew that there wasn't going to be a lot of help available to me to be able to pay for school. But I also knew that college was really important. And coming from a family where, like, both of my parents were high school dropouts, I don't know if my birth dad graduated high school, but I didn't spend a lot of time with him. So I always kind of thought that was probably irrelevant because he wasn't really an example in my life. But my stepdad and my mom didn't graduate high school. But my stepdad was a really hard worker. So I knew how to work hard. And I had hoped that that ethic would carry over into doing something like the military or going to college. So I joined the Army on delayed entry the summer before my senior year. And I was set to go to Fort Jackson for basic training in the summer of 2003, right after I graduated. A week later, I met the man who would become my husband. I thought I had my life finally figured out. I think that's really where, how audacious of me to think that I have my life figured out. The world kind of just moves on, and I think the universe always throws us a little bit of a laugh when we think we have things figured out. Because every time that I've been like, oh, I got this, I know what's happening now, I'm going to plan the rest of my life. And something always happens, and I'm like, oh, crap, it's a curveball, and you have to adjust. I met my husband, and my husband is a person that I have known for a very long time. I knew him when I was about 6. His house was like a block from my house, and we grew up together. His dad was the police officer that frequently showed up to arrest my parents when I was pretty young. So that's a really complicated dynamic to bring in to a family. It made things interesting for sure. I was dating someone else when I met him. I had no plans to date him. I just knew him from my childhood, and he had always been a really positive person in my childhood. So when we bumped into each other that night, he was driving around with his friends in his car, and we're old. So this is what you did. Is that you would get in your car, fill up the tank, and you drive back and forth down the street and like try to run into your friends, listen to music, just hang out. Sometimes you park and just hang out and listen to music. And he honked at me and then revved his engine at me, and finally he kept passing back and forth because he was going back and forth down the road. And he finally stopped. And I was like, "What? You look so familiar. What's your name?" And he told me, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, I know you." And he was like, "Is it a good or a bad thing?" Which, knowing him, like, how would it ever be a bad thing? He's one of the most positive people I've ever met. But it was a very good thing. So we went for a drive with him. I had a friend with me that her parents were going through a divorce, and she needed some extra support. So I was walking with her that night just so that she could talk and get some stuff off her chest. And we ran into him, and we both got in, and we drove around through the hills by the town that we were in and listened to music from the early 2000s, which I won't embarrass myself by talking about, but it was the first positive moment in a long, long line of not so positive moments. So we hung out that day. I gave him my phone number, and he gave me his cell number, which was a big deal back then. And from then on, whenever he would be around, he worked in another part of the state and lived near where he worked, but he would come down on his weekends, which he worked the actual weekend. So the days that he would be around my hometown area was always Sunday through Wednesday. So on Sunday, he would work his afternoon evening shift. He usually worked from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. So at 6 a.m. when he got off on Sunday, he would drive down to our hometown and hang out with me. And then he would pick me up for school Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and drop me off. And then we would hang out after school. And in the beginning, he was going through a really messy divorce. And I was still dating someone else. So we just spent a little bit of time driving around. He just really needed somebody to talk to, I think. And we weren't dating. We were just forging a really strong friendship. And we spent probably the first 3-4 months just hanging out whenever he had come down. He wasn't coming down every weekend for him, but when he was down here helping his parents or whatever, because his parents lived in the same town, he would come and stop and hang out with me. And eventually it got to a point that I was like, I kind of don't want to see anybody else. I kind of just want to hang out with him. And I told him that one day on the phone, and I was so embarrassed, but I do remember like telling him, like, I kind of just really like spending time with you. It's weird to describe because even at that time, even that night, that first night when I met him, I think I knew. I think I knew that he was it. He was so different from everybody that I had ever had in my life, and he was so respectful. He never, ever had anything negative to say. He wasn't condescending. He was always just really kind. And I hadn't had someone like that in my life. So I kind of got to a point where I didn't want anything else. I just wanted that. I just wanted to feel the way that I felt when I was with him all the time. And we talked about it, and I had never wanted to get married. I didn't want a family. After I had seen mine get torn apart the way that it did and experience the things that I had with my family, the last thing that I wanted was to create another family like that. I knew that families didn't have to be that way, obviously. I mean, I had friends that they were healthy, high functioning human beings, but I didn't know how to have that family. And so when my husband was like, what do you think about marriage? That was a really hard conversation to have because part of me still was holding on to those old ideas where I was like, you know what, I don't want anything to do with that. I don't want that because I went through so much pain. I don't want to cause that for another person. And I still make a lot of the decisions that I have to make today based on that same logic. Like, I have been through some really shitty stuff. And the last thing that I want is to create that in any way for another person. So when we were talking about it, he was like, well, what if it was the right person? And I think at that point, the gears were already turning for him. I don't want to put words in his mouth. I'll have to interview him on another episode and get his feedback on all of this. But at that point in time, I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Because what I had wanted changed. And it changed with him becoming a part of my life. And I don't know how else to describe it except that for the first time ever, my soul just felt like it was home with him. I don't know that we ever really like officially dated each other. We just spent a lot of time together. We were really good friends. Like I said, he was still going through a really messy divorce, and there was just a lot going on in both of our lives. And then I started my senior year in high school, and we were still spending a lot of time together. But one day on his weekend, he picked me up and he took me up on the mountain near where we live, and he took me on this hike, and we walked up. It was so long. I remember I was complaining probably the whole time. I was like, where are we going? Like, why is it so far? My feet hurt. I was just I don't know how he put up with me for so long. He took me to this rock, and it was pretty far up. We had to hike I don't know, maybe it wasn't very far, but it felt far. And we walked way up there and we sat on this rock and we were talking. And he was like, I know that this is not necessarily what you planned, and we can always make adjustments in the future if we need to, but I want you to be a permanent part of my life. And he gave me a ring. It wasn't an engagement ring, but it was a ring. And I think it was about a month later that he proposed to me with a real ring. The other one was real too, but this time it was an engagement ring. And the rest is kind of history. Like, we got married and had 2 kids. I found out shortly before I graduated that I was pregnant. And the funny thing is, I didn't graduate. My husband also joined the military, and I went with him to drop him off at the airport the day he was supposed to leave. And it was the same day that we had a test for the state for one of my classes, and I didn't pass that class because of that. I went to the airport to drop him off, and I moved in with his parents. We got married about a month before that happened. And we just about eloped because things with my family were really stressful. We had moved in together when I was 17. I had my 18th birthday in our apartment, and things were not good, so we had to take a break for a little while, but we did end up getting married. And then, he was gone to basic training for 6 weeks, I think. And then they sent him home because he messed up his back. And it was kind of perfect timing because when he got home, we found out that I had the same complication with my pregnancy that my mom had with my brother. And I was put on bed rest, and I couldn't do anything. A month after he got home, I was induced, and 2 days later, we had our little baby girl. And it was really stressful and so scary because I was not prepared for it. I remember I was like, I don't know how to be a mom. How does a person who's had this, disconnect from their parent show up and parent another human being? It was really a challenge for me. And I had some really extreme highs and lows. My husband's really good at staying grounded, which I was super grateful for, especially in those first few months of being a parent. Our daughter had colic, and so from 6 to 10 every night, she would cry. But it wasn't like a normal baby cry. It sounded like she was in pain, and she would curl up, and I think she just had stomach cramps, but I can't say, I don't really know. But I know that she was in pain, and for about 4 hours every night she would just scream and nothing would soothe her. Luckily, we were living in his mom and dad's house, and his mom was like, you can just go outside, just go for a walk somewhere, go for a drive, whatever you've got to do, but she's fine. She's safe here. If she needs anything, I'm here. And so we did. We would go out and walk or go for a drive or whatever because it was so hard to hear her in pain and know that there was nothing I could do about it. So during those highs and lows, then my husband was like, I think you need to see a doctor. And I was like, why? And he said, I think you might have bipolar disorder. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? And he was like, well, here's all the symptoms that I see. I can't speak to what you know and what you feel, but he's like, these are the things that I'm seeing. And everything that he was saying, I was like, yeah, that's true. And then when he was talking about the things that you feel, I was like, that's also pretty true. I mean, not all the boxes were checked, but a lot of them were. And he was like, I think you need to go see a doctor. He was really concerned about my emotional health and about me being able to be fully present for our children. And so I went to a doctor. They did diagnose me as having bipolar disorder. And I took medication for that off and on for about 12 years. I was only off of medication during the time that I was pregnant with my son. And I took just about every medication that they had for this. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. Some of them worked better than others. And some of them we had to combine with other medications. I ended up taking antidepressants for a really long time. At the end of 12 years, I was taking 3 separate medications to try to balance this. I had been through therapy. I thought I had dealt with my trauma. I went through therapy when my daughter was about 4 and unpacked all of this. I had unpacked my childhood. I had unpacked everything I could remember. And I had started trying to move to a place where I felt at peace with all of it. Forgiveness, like I said, forgiveness in the beginning was really hard for me. I did spend a very long time angry. I think I was probably angry for 2 years. And I didn't understand why or how to move past anger. So for a long time, I just ignored it because it was easier. Then I decided in 2009 that I was going to go back to college. And at that point, my son was almost 2, I think. He was pretty little. I was working full time. I wasn't making very much more than minimum wage. We were having a really hard time making ends meet. But I told my husband, I was like, if I went back to school and got a degree, maybe I'd be able to help provide more to our family. Like I said, I didn't graduate high school, so I had to go back and take the GED. That test was so stressful. It was easy because I had actually learned the information in high school, but it was stressful because accessing the information that I had learned like 6 years prior to that was really difficult. If you are in a situation where you have to take the GED, do it right away. Don't put it off because it gets way harder. It gets way harder to learn all of that stuff. So I went to school for 4 years and graduated with my Bachelor of Science in Graphic Design in 2013. Around that time period, I was a stay-at-home mom. I wasn't working anymore. My husband had a pretty good job. 2011, we lost my father-in-law. He had cancer. He had squamous cell skin cancer, and we found out about 5 years previous to him passing away that he had a form of leukemia. And he did treatment for both of those for some years and just got really sick and really was having a hard time getting day-to-day stuff done. And in 2011, when he passed away, the last thing that he told my husband was, make sure you take care of your mom. So a month later, we moved into his childhood home with his mom. She had health issues for a long time. She probably had 10 years of different health issues that were ongoing that she was trying to maintain. So she had arthritis, she had issues with her feet where she had to have the bones reconstructed. She had back problems. She had already been through cancer treatment for cancer in her kidney. She had osteoporosis, and she was starting to experience symptoms of chronic widespread pain. They diagnosed her with polymyalgia later on, and she couldn't live in the house by herself. She tried to sell the house for a couple of weeks before we moved down, but it just wasn't happening. Like, something always kept coming up that it wasn't working out. And so we decided the best thing was going to be to move here with her. The thing that was hard about it was we had our kids in school. My husband had a really good job, and we had to uproot all of that stuff we left all of that behind and moved in with her. And at first, it was really, really hard. One, because we're very different people. Um, and I tried to be sensitive to that, but it's always easier to look back and say, oh, I should have done this differently. And I feel that way about a lot of things in my life, but I'm so grateful for the lessons that I learned from them. So we lived with her for the last 9 years. And about a year ago, she finally passed away too. I was her caregiver, her primary caregiver for 9 years before she passed away. And she ended up being that example that I needed because, like I said before, I was really concerned about like how do you show up and be a parent to people when you've never had a consistent parent in your life. So she ended up being a really good example for me and helping me through some of the harder things of being a parent that I was not well equipped to deal with. So I leaned on her a lot. And we're actually coming up on a year of her being gone in about a week. And that's partially what has delayed this episode. I had planned to record it earlier in the month, but there are a lot of very raw emotions that come with the year anniversary of losing someone so close to you. So, big shout out to everybody who's just kind of held on and waited while I got my shit together so I could record this episode. You guys have been really patient and I appreciate it. So in 2017, I started a job, the first job ever, really using my degree that paid more than minimum wage. The first job I ever had that I earned more than minimum wage, and I didn't think that I was worth it. And that's really hard realization. I was in that job for about 2 years, and another opportunity came up. The environment of the team that I was on had started to become something that did not feel supportive to who I was trying to become. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with the people on that team. It's not to say that there's anything wrong with my manager. I have nothing but positive things to say about her. She was a wonderful person. She dealt with some of my heavy feelings going through these changes. And a month before I got that job, I stopped taking medication for bipolar disorder. My manager was really patient with me. I was still trying to figure out who I was, I think. So to be a 32-year-old and not know who you are, not know what you like, not know how to connect with yourself, that was a very steep learning curve. In 2017, I decided that 2018 was going to be my year of yes. And I know that sounds kind of weird. So the idea behind it was that I was going to say yes to anything that was not destructive, anything that was not going to damage my relationships, and any opportunity for growth. As soon as I opened myself up for that, let me tell you, the universe just knows and just sends you everything. So I ended up saying yes to a lot of things that I normally wouldn't say yes to. And that was the whole idea, was for growth, right? So that I could learn, who am I? I still don't know, just so you're aware. I don't know if I'll ever really arrive at that destination, but that year was a lot of fun to figure out who I was. It was also really stressful. It was hard. So in 2017 or 18, I think it was 2018, my first guest here on the podcast, Jen, she got hired on by the company that I was working for. And I found out that she and I were actually going to be working directly with each other. Jen was exactly the person that I needed to be there with me during that time as a friend. And it's funny that it came about because of a work thing, but she and I started working together, and that's when I started training to do Highland Games. I had signed up for the group in my state that practices this. I had not been to a practice yet. I had figured I need to at least get strong. I didn't want to hurt myself. If you've never seen Highland Games, go to YouTube and type in Scottish Highland Games. There's so many videos of this, and it comes up with some really cool stuff. But my big item, my big ticket item that I wanted to be able to do was I wanted to be able to toss the caber, which is, it looks like a telephone pole. They are anywhere from 16 to 19 feet long, and they weigh, depending on what weight class you're in, they can weigh anywhere from, I don't know, 70 pounds to over 100. It's pretty heavy. But I told Jen, I was like, I don't want to hurt myself doing that. I want to do it. Like, and I could feel that drive to do this thing. But I was like, I just really don't want to get hurt. So we started training and working on that. And through that training, she asked me questions that no one had ever asked me. Like me saying, oh, I don't think I'll ever do that. And she would say, why? And I had no answer for that. I didn't know. I think it was that I had learned my whole life that I would never do those things. There was a long list of things that would never be me. But she posed a really good question. Why? Why not? Why can't that be something I do? And so to have that shift, to move from thinking these things are not for me, they're for better people, and then have that thinking become something like, why not me? It was pretty interesting. And that really is when the ball started rolling. Shortly after that, my job gave me the opportunity to travel and work in Canada. And I had never traveled, not by plane anyway. I had never gone more than maybe 700 miles from home. We drove to Idaho once when I was 9 for a family reunion. Like, that's as far from home as I had ever been. So I was pretty freaked out, but it was the year of yes, and I was like, "Okay, this is something I've set up for myself. I have to hold myself to it." And it was really scary, and it was really hard. I had to get a passport. I had never been on a plane. I had never flown anywhere. I had never been anywhere international, which is why I had to get a passport. And on top of all of that, I had never spent more than a couple of days away from my husband from the time that he got back from his basic training. So I was scared. I was really scared, but I knew I needed it. I knew I needed to go, and I knew that I had to say yes to it. So I did everything that I needed to do to be able to go, and I was really lucky to have the support of my husband. He was like, it's going to be really hard, and we're going to miss you a lot. But I went and I worked up there, and it was a week that I was there. And then when I came home, I felt like a different person. In 2019, I signed up and they didn't have a novice class for Highland Games, so I didn't get to compete and do that. But they did have strongman the day before. And I was really scared of that. If you listen to episode 1, you can hear me talk about it a little bit there too. But I remember signing up for the event online because we had to pay the registration fee and showing up to the field. And I remember I saw one of the competitors who happens to be the 3rd strongest woman in the world. And when I saw her, I was like, oh man, what did I sign myself up for? What are you doing? Like, what are you doing to yourself? And I remember having an internal dialogue where myself was like, you don't belong here. You can't do this. You should just go home. Normally, I probably would have. But this, again, was something that felt important to me. So I took a deep breath, went for 20 seconds of courage, signed my name on the form, filled out the paperwork at the sign-in booth, and walked over and introduced myself. And it was terrifying. But I can say that that day created a sisterhood with these women that has changed the way, not only that I look at myself, but the way that I see other women. And that was amazing. I placed dead last, which I knew would be the case. But there was only 6 women total that were competing that evening, and there was 2 in each weight class. So I got second place for my weight class, which sounds a lot better than placing dead last. Then in December of that year, 2019, my husband bought me a DNA kit for Christmas. And we had talked about it off and on, but I had a lot of questions about where do my people come from, my ancestors. I only knew about a quarter of my own ancestry because, for sure, anyway, I had theoreticals for some of it, but for sure, I only knew 1/4 of it because my mother also did not know her father. He left when she was about 6 months old, and she never got to know who he was. So he got me this DNA kit, and I filled up the tube and sent it out. And let me tell you, like, that tube looks small, but when you're trying to come up with saliva to fill the tube, it feels really big. It took me almost the time limit to be able to fill up that tube. So I did that, and I sent out the kit, and I waited. And while I was waiting, I was thinking about this sister that I have on my dad's side that I only met once, and wondering where she was. But I didn't know if she had his last name or her mom's last name, or, where she was, or where to even begin looking for her. And I was kind of at a loss. I knew she was out there, and it felt important to find her. It took 3 months to get the results back from that DNA test, and that felt like a really long 3 months. When I got the results back, it matched me to members of my birth father's family. It was the man that I thought it was my whole life. So to have that confirmation, then I was like, okay, now I can start looking for this sister. I can start trying to figure out where she is. I think it was probably a week later, I got a recommendation from Instagram for this person. And this person had my sister's name. Like I said earlier, when you say, I'm ready for this, you better be really ready, because when you think that you're ready for something, the universe just starts sending it to you. So I clicked on her profile, and her profile had her email address in it. And I wrote an email and put it in my draft folder. And I went back to that email 3 or 4 times and reworded stuff and rewrote the email. And I didn't send it. Number 1, I didn't know if she knew about me at all. Number 2, because the last thing that I wanted was to be something that shows up in her life and disrupts it or causes her some kind of negative feeling, right? So I rewrote it. And finally, I was talking to my husband, and I think he said, just send it. So I sent the email. I think it was the first week of April that I sent the email. And about a week later, she sent me an email back. She said that she didn't know about me, but she was grateful that I had reached out to her. And we started talking through email and talking through text. She was going through some stuff at the time, but she ended up coming out to Utah in the summer of 2020. And that was a big deal because we were like in the middle of this huge lockdown for the pandemic. She had to come back for some stuff with her family. And she was like, I really want to meet you. And I was absolutely terrified because I didn't want her to reject me the way that our dad had rejected me. But I said, okay. And I was really excited to meet her. So I texted her and we met up for lunch. And when she came walking in, I had my phone face down on the counter, and on the back of my phone case, I have a Cheshire cat. I've always really loved Alice in Wonderland, Ever since I was little, I also love the story of Peter Pan. I like some of the ones that have a little bit of a twist to them. I really have always loved like Tim Burton's work, The Nightmare Before Christmas. I loved Sleepy Hollow. I loved so many of his other movies that I watched as a young person. So I got this phone case because I was like, oh, that's really cool. She has the exact same Cheshire Cat as a tattoo. It was so weird because she came in, she was like, "You've got to be kidding me." And the more that we talked that day, the more that we realized how much we were like each other. And over the last year of talking with her, well, I guess it's a year and a half now, but over the time of talking to her, we have learned how much we are like each other. We're different, of course, because we're different people, but there's a lot of things that are very similar. And it's so weird to meet another human that has so much of your same tendencies and your same ideas and your same feelings about things when you've never met them. On her way home, she stopped at our dad's house and confronted him about it. And then he reached out to me to tell me to leave her alone and that she wasn't my sister and that she would never be my sister. And he had a lot of very unkind words. And I told him, I'm sorry you feel that way, and that I'm not trying to stir anything up. I'm not trying to cause problems. I just want to know my sister. And he told me that he had taken a DNA test at one point, and it said that he was only a 33% match, which means it could be him or two other guys, which further sells that story that it could only possibly be him. But the way that I operate is that I research things pretty heavily before I jump into them. And DNA doesn't work that way. It doesn't say you're a 33% match. It either says yes, you are, or no, you're not. And then if you really dive into it and you have somebody who knows how to read these things, you can look into how much DNA you share with each other, and it will show you how many segments you have in common. And from there, you can estimate how related you are to each other. But back in like the 80s and 90s, a paternity test was pass or fail. It wasn't about 30%. It wasn't about, any of that. And back then they also didn't have the same technology to be able to say you share this many segments with each other. That's recently been discovered. I mean, recently I say like within the 2000s that they've been using that from what I understand. So when he said that, I was like, why would you choose to lie to me to further your own story? Like, to me, that doesn't make any sense. But I'm not here to dissect that. I just am here to give the outline. So she told him that she didn't want anything to do with him if he wasn't going to recognize me as part of their family. And I told him in my message back, I was like, you know what? Whether I'm her sister or not is her decision. It's not up to you. And I don't need someone to come in and tell me how to live my life now. I'm 35 at that point, and I already have a dad. My stepdad was there for all my important things. I don't need somebody to step in and be my dad now. I'm sad that things haven't changed for him and that he won't get to know me and my family. Because I feel like my life is pretty good, and I feel like my family is pretty good. Like, I have hilarious kids. It makes me really sad that he won't ever know them, but this is his choice, right? My sister and I have still been talking, and in November, I found out that my stepdad had pancreatic cancer. And 12 years before that, my mom's mom had also had pancreatic cancer, and a month later, she died from it. So to get that call, I was like, well, I just basically shut down any potential relationship with my birth dad because I blocked him after I pissed him off. And so I was like, oh, great. Now the only dad that I have is fighting for his life. Luckily, that has gone extremely well, and he has done a really good job fighting it. He's still around. I just saw him yesterday. The doctors are pretty optimistic. He's got some surgery on Thursday of this coming week to have the cancer removed. It is a pretty in-depth surgery. If you have never heard of it, you can Google the Whipple surgery. That's what they're doing with him. They have to remove the top of the pancreas and reroute ductwork and all that stuff. But the thing that's dangerous about it is when you're dealing with anything in the gastrointestinal tract at all, there's potential for infection. So, we're just hoping that he'll get through that. And after I found out that my dad had cancer, I started another round of therapy. I was still processing the loss of my mother-in-law. And then I found out that my dad had cancer, and I knew that was too much for me to try to deal with by myself. So I started therapy, and I went through grief counseling, which only lasted about a month. And then I had some trauma stuff that started coming up. And I was like, all right, I guess this is what we're doing now. So I shifted gears and started seeing a trauma counselor and doing EMDR. And I've mentioned that in a previous episode. I believe episode 1's show notes has some information about EMDR in it, but I'll also put them in the show notes for this. I can't advocate for that enough. It changed a lot of things for me. It also is part of the reason that I had that memory come back to me, but I also had other good memories come back to me, like really early ones from when I was 4 or 5, spending time with my mom and my siblings, and really positive, happy memories of my childhood that I didn't have before, because I was able to process some of these things and move them to a place where it's no longer traumatic for me. To be able to do that has helped me in being able to reforge this relationship with my mom. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I've been spending a lot of time trying to improve that relationship. It is an important one. I mean, you can say you don't need somebody as much as you want, but it is important to have those people in your life, especially the key people like your parents. And being able to look at my mom and know that she has her own trauma, and know that she's still working through her own stuff, and see her as just a human being doing the best that she can, that really changed the way that I perceived our relationship. It also made it so that I was able to deal with the feelings that have come up with having my dad in cancer treatment. I've been able to handle that a lot better and process through them a lot better than I think I would have without it, because I've moved some of these hard things that I was dealing with out of the way. So if you are in need of help, the app that I've used over and over again is BetterHelp. They do a great job. They match you with a therapist based on what you're looking for and what your beliefs are. They have support for individuals within the LGBTQ plus community. They have support for grief. They have support for trauma. They have support for just about anything that you could need a counselor for. And it's a really great platform. The therapists that they have on that platform are really helpful and make a really good effort to try to connect with you as an individual and support you the best way that they can. There's a lot of really good information on there, even if you're not a client, I guess, a paying client. They do have a lot of good resources on the website, so you can check them out. This is not an advertisement for them. I'm just simply putting it out there. If anybody needs some help, they're an excellent source of help. I have used them 3 times in the last 10 years. And I've spoken with multiple therapists on their platform. I've never had an issue with any of them. They are very professional. And the good part is that if you have an HSA account, they do accept that payment method, and it's approved through the government to be a source where you can use your HSA. So if you have that option, that's great. If you don't, there are some other resources available. I will put links to all of those things in the show notes. There's text platforms, there's web-based platforms where you can reach out for help if you need someone, and there are a lot of resources that are free. Mental health care is not as accessible as it should be, and it's not available to everyone. Everyone should be able to put their mental health first, regardless of age, regardless of gender, regardless of color, any of those things. We should all have access to mental health care. This is something that I've always been really passionate about, even when I was younger, even when I was in high school. Like, this is a big deal to be able to take care of your mental health. So please, if you're struggling, reach out, ask for help, but know that whatever you're going through and whatever you're feeling, your feelings are valid. I believe now, after having gone through intense trauma therapy, that I was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder. I think that what was happening is I was having a trauma response and the symptoms matched the symptoms of bipolar disorder. So you can follow the holistic psychologist. She's one of my favorite. I also love Michelle at the Adult Chair. She does a great job of teaching people how to speak to themselves from the adult perspective, which is what the Adult Chair is. She has a writing challenge. I believe it's every November that you can journal, and there's journal prompts that come through that you can write about these things and kind of start unpacking some of these things for yourself. Another one that I really love is Dr. Nedra Tawwab. She's great about boundaries and how to set healthy boundaries and hold them. She does have a book that was just released earlier this year that I absolutely love. Those are really good starting points if you don't have access to mental health care, or if you are not wanting to start that route maybe, and you want to try to do some of this work by yourself. I have in the past recommended The Body Keeps the Score. That book really changed the way that I felt about some of the things that I had gone through. It is kind of a hard read. It can be very triggering, just know that, if you decide to go that route. Another book that's great is It Didn't Start With You. That's about family trauma patterns that get passed down. I love the way that that one kind of frames some of these things, and it makes it so that you can see the patterns that are repeating. And I definitely have been able to notice my own family patterns. The other things that I would recommend is journaling all of your feelings, writing them down. That makes a big difference. Even if it's a blog, even if you just want to do like an audio recording of what you're going through in the day, something about writing or typing or speaking things out loud allows the left and right hemispheres of the brain to connect and to interpret what's happening, because you have like the emotional side of your brain, but you also have the logic side. So if you're feeling really emotional, all of those are really good options to help both sides of your brain communicate with each other so that you can process what's going on. I hope that this was an interesting episode. I don't know that my story really is interesting. It's just a story, I guess. And I don't know that I would say that I'm necessarily the quote unquote hero of the story, but it does follow that path a little bit. The one recurring thing about my life that I do remember is always believing there has to be something more. There has to be. Even at a young age, I believed that. I remember being quite little and thinking, my dad's never home. My mom's not really connected. There has to be more. And I remember thinking, even when my mom got remarried and the people that I spent my time with and the boys that I had dated, I just remember always feeling like this can't be everything. There has to be more. There has to be more to life. And now I'm at the point where I know that there's more because I've achieved that over and over again. Now I just want to see what is more. I hope that you guys enjoyed this episode. If you have questions or comments, feel free to pop over to the website. If you want to leave a review for the show, you can do that. It helps people find us on Apple Podcasts. And until next time, stay mystical.